Good morning, good afternoon, depending where people are joining us today. My name is Brian Cozzolino. I'm director at Gulf Intelligence. I'll be monitoring this session. But just for those who are joining now and unfortunately weren't able to join the plenary session, to give some background on how today came about and the theme behind this forum is essentially in 2015, we had gathered the top 100 stakeholders in Oman, ranging from CEOs to government officials and academia, to essentially create an Oman energy master plan. And what came forward from that exercise was the establishment of 5 pillars that had to be addressed. Over the course of those years, we've had Oman energy forums putting forward action plans and recommendations for each of those pillars. One was energy demand, energy supply. Another one was R&D. Labor is another one as well. And then, of course, the last pillar, which is the theme of today's energy forum, is the water, food, energy nexus. So we're looking to address this challenge and, of course, come with some solutions, recommendations, and actions that can be taken forward for Oman, but of course, the wider region as well. So thank you for joining the session today. Of course, we're tackling circular economy, best circular economy approach for Oman to create a sustainable water, food, energy nexus, taking in best practices and, of course, the insights from our esteemed speakers. We have Karl Feilder, who's the CEO, founder, and chairman of Neutral Fuels. Aditya Shah, who's the head of circular economy investments from Creek Capital. Peter Godfrey, who's the managing director of the Energy Institute. Jessica Obeid, who's the non-resident scholar, Middle East Institute, and senior global advisor for Azure strategy. Karl, I just wanted to kick off with you to first get your opening comments and insights on the critical question and where you see Neutral Fuels playing a role in driving a circular economy, specifically addressing water, food, energy nexus challenges.
Thanks very much, and good morning to everybody. I think the essential requirement is a rethink of the way we've been doing things for the last 100 years. I think that the key focus for most of the renewables energy content of this is that it is essentially a local supply, local demand situation. We've realized with Neutral Fuels that most of the raw materials we require for low carbon fuels are actually present in every city of the world. And the offtake requirement is in every city of the world. So we actually think we should have a factory in every city of the world. It doesn't make any sense to me to move the raw materials halfway around the world and then ship the finished product halfway around the world. We've just got to do local, local, local. And whilst my focus is definitely on fuel, I can see that this has a similar type of situation for the grid mix of electricity. We should be doing local solar, whether it's CSP or whether it's some sort of PV implementation. And the same goes for desal. These need to be far more localized solutions that are closer to the offtake and the supply.
And just a follow-up to that, what do you think are the main challenges in terms of the development of those local solutions and implementation?
Well, particularly in the Middle East. I'm currently talking to you today from Riyadh, and I don't think the situation in the kingdom is very much different from many of the other countries in the Middle East, where it's been historically the demand of government to have those services centralized, where there is essentially one supplier of power, one supplier of fuel, one supplier of water. And essentially, these markets need to open up and they need to be put into a more competitive environment, which will produce benefits for society as well for the government. So I think that the main challenge for most of the Middle Eastern countries is the deregulation of these key components to this nexus.
Jessica, I just want to bring you in on that as well to get your opening comments and your thoughts, building off of what Karl said in terms of that decentralization aspect.
Yeah, absolutely agree with this. I think we need to rethink to assess the entire life cycles and to do an entire assessment of also the supply chain to see what we can localize, what we can close as a cycle, which would also bring an angle of innovation in terms of what products we can also develop as services, as sharing mechanisms, especially when we talk about agriculture, food, what kind of mechanisms we can put in favor and the advantage of farmers in terms of probably off-grid mobile, off-grid PV systems that they can share. And I'm also going to bring the angle of virtual water, which often falls off the discussion, but all this food is also needing, and everything we process and manufacture is also taking huge amounts of water in terms of process and production that also needs to be factored in. And then we need to find what we can use in a circular economy and what we still have to bring from abroad.
From a circular economy approach, just overall, taking a step back with the notion and the theory and practical implementation of it, are you seeing here in the Middle East that is having big uptake? Is there being big strides of that in the Middle East that we're seeing in terms of a push across this nexus to achieve a circular model as opposed to linear?
So we find mostly that the circular economy is still very much interlinked to waste management. So when we think of circular economy, we do think of waste to energy and waste management. There are some small initiatives. Also, when we look into the informal economy, that's plenty of circular mechanisms that we need to adopt on national scale, but also that would bring the angles. So Karl has brought the angle of the regulation and deregulating this market, but also we need to mainstream circular economy across all the policies and bring in, align all the institutions. There's also going to be a lot of work.
Sounds like a big challenge, and I think conversations that we do have with our stakeholders, they're still kind of in the ABCs aspect of it at the moment. And we've heard big announcements in the Middle East, net zero targets and everything, but now it's really the implementation phase and the action phase to take forward. Peter, I just want to bring you in, of course, to get your opening comments, having a substantial oil and gas background as well. Do you see the energy sector leading this circular economy push, and of course being the leader in the food, water, energy nexus? Do you think that would be the key pillar across this collaborative approach?
Thanks very much, Brian. And firstly, let me say that I agree 150% with Karl and Jessica in terms of Karl's words, local, local, local. So to my mind, the challenge for the energy community is to create this deglobalized view, this more community-based view of what energy of the future is all about and how one can manage one's supply and value chains within that context. So let me just talk about a couple of things from here in Singapore. Number one, Karl talked about urbanization. I'm actually going to question the issue of urbanization because actually within the context of the energy, food, water nexus, the issue of urbanization versus communities and actually giving communities more empowerment to develop the circular economy going forwards is a key issue that I think needs to be addressed, particularly in a country like Oman that has been entirely reliant on the energy sector for its economy, and it needs to diversify and create a much different socio-economic model going forwards. So to my mind, the whole issue is much deeper than just looking at the energy sector alone. The second issue, which Jessica alluded to, is there is no energy, food, water nexus without waste, and the concentration on waste as well. So whatever one looks at, whether it be agriculture, whether it be water, whether it be energy, the issue of how one manages waste and where possible creates product out of waste is absolutely fundamental and key to developing a circular economy wherever it is. And here in Singapore, we can talk about the water story, but even at a city level, even at urbanization level, we are now recognizing that actually what we want to do is rezone our cities in order to create that community-focused way of dealing with circularity within the context of the way we're going to look at the future. So to my mind, this issue of community-based management as opposed to centrally based management is absolutely core to the way we move forwards.
Karl, do you just want to add comments to that in terms of the approach of the community-based management aspect?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, I agree with most of what Peter was saying. That makes a lot of sense. But I rather think that one step at a time is going to get us there in the Middle East. Talking about a change to the way that the socioeconomic balance works is probably a decades-long challenge that we have to look at, and moving to a more community-based system when we do have in most of the countries a very centralized approach at the moment is quite a challenge. But we have seen quite a number of moves, and indeed this week we've seen a move in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. So rather than on a national level for the UAE, the community of the Abu Dhabi Emirate has declared that all of their waste cooking oil must be recycled into biofuel, and that any restaurant and hotel that does not participate is subject to fines or suspension of their trade license. So this is really a carrot and stick approach with them. And the circularity of that is that all of that produced biofuel is used within the Emirate of Abu Dhabi for their own decarbonisation efforts. So this is a fantastic exemplar of the way forward. But to come back to what was mentioned earlier by Jessica, is that the management of that is the key. And the only reason that that was possible in Abu Dhabi is that they have what they call an e-manifest system. So all waste is tracked, and it's tracked on a computer system using software where everybody knows. And I think coming back to what both Jessica and Peter were saying, the challenge for most people in this region is that it is called waste. Actually, we should recategorize it. It's not waste, it's raw material. And we should certainly stop exporting it overseas. That's just madness. We need to keep these raw materials in our countries to create in-country value where they exist at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I think in our plenary session, we had our key oil and gas stakeholders, energy, looking at waste as an opportunity moving forward and taking advantage of that. And that's very much been a theme throughout the day so far. I just want to bring in Aditya to get your opening comments and your thoughts tackling the critical question. Where do you think, coming from Create Capital, is the main aspect that needs to be addressed first in this Nexus challenge? Circular economy, of course, covers, we're talking about 3 segments, but everything essentially at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with all 3 of the speakers so far. I mean, decentralization is the way forward and is a very, very important pillar of our investment strategy at Creek. So everything we do at Creek, or all the investments that we make, whether it's in energy transition, whether it's in circular economy, it's all decentralized. And some of the challenges that need to be addressed is on the regulatory side. So there needs to be enough regulatory support going in to ensure that there is decentralization, and an extension of what Karl said earlier, that there needs to be an enabling framework for private participation and development of decentralized infrastructure across the region. And at the same time, look at financing this infrastructure differently. So providing infrastructure as a service rather than investing in large-scale decentralized infrastructure. So that's the model that we have adopted, and we see that being rolled out across the region. So you are offering water as a service, you're offering electricity as a service, you're offering waste management as a service, you're offering agriculture as a service. That's something that we're looking at now as well. And like what Karl said, one person's waste is another person's resource. So there's no reason to look at that as waste. It's resource, and valorizing these resources requires an enabling framework. So this might be a bit off topic, but on the matter of waste not being separate from this nexus, as long as you're able to dump it for free, there's no way you're able to valorize waste, or use this waste as a resource. So you need a regulatory framework which is available and supportive of such kind of initiatives.
Why do you think there hasn't been that regulatory framework that's put forward yet? We're just coming off of COP26, the Middle East, for example, it's going to be hosting COP27, COP28. Yeah. There's massive opportunities around this space. Do you think that things will accelerate to establish that and take advantage of this opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are seeing all the regions in basically all the countries in the region taking a step in that direction. Like starting January, Dubai is going to introduce a landfill fee. Which is there is no reason why it will not stimulate the recycling industry here in the Emirate. Similarly, you have such initiative planned for some of the other Emirates. So you have these steps which are being taken to divert waste away from landfill. All of the countries have made commitments, over the next, 7 to 10 years to divert waste away from landfill. So, these are steps that, we see, which will be increasingly taken by all of these regions here.
Jessica, I just want to bring you back in, and of course, we mentioned the Abu Dhabi example. Big part of that's being able to monitor things and have transparency behind it. Data plays a big role in that. What is your thoughts on a kind of recommendation in enhancing transparency in this space and taking that opportunity to really take advantage of waste, for example, to be able to create that framework that we've Karl's example in Abu Dhabi was able to be put forward.
So digitization is very, very important. We say in engineering, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So you do need better monitoring and better management. And the world is moving towards more digitization. So e-governance and digitization would provide all this medium to have more transparency, but also enable us to make better decision-making based on, well, data. So yeah, I totally agree with this, and that we need more digitization across the region.
And you've mentioned, innovation, entrepreneurship in this space. Are you seeing the right foundation in order to build that segment across the Nexus, to help push the circular economy forward? Or do you think that more steps are needed in order to create that ecosystem?
So as Peter has mentioned, it is community-based approaches. So I do believe that it would come more from also communities and people-centered approaches that would come from people. We do have an advantage in the region that a large share of the population is actually youth. And this youth population is struggling with employment opportunities. So now is the time for actually to unleash all the innovation, entrepreneurship. We definitely do need better ecosystems, but the need is there, and the capacity and the talent is there. So I do believe they create the best environment to unleash more entrepreneurship, innovation, more systems that would be triggered from the community to the community.
Peter, I just want to get your thoughts. Jessica just mentioned Middle East being heavily, I would say, in terms of population-wise, made up of youth. Of course, unemployment across the Middle East is a big issue. And then looking at the energy sector, as the oil and gas companies and energy companies shift during this transition, talent, of course, is critical in order to drive that transformation. What are your thoughts in terms of the energy sector, how they're doing so far in attracting new talent? Do you think that in our plenary session today, there's still a perspective that the oil and gas industry essentially may not have the most positive image, but the industry itself has created great solutions, great technological advances, and energy security is still a key part of this world. What are your thoughts on the talent aspect in terms of creating this circular economy, and how do you think energy companies can posture themselves to do better to attract that?
Well, I think the energy companies, to a certain extent, are able to attract the right sort of resource for where they're going. But I come back to Jessica's point, because I am a firm believer that the energy sector needs to find ways to decentralize and become more local in terms of the way they develop. Now, the issue for me is not just about technology, it's not just about skills, it's about economic rent. In that, at the end of the day, the energy sector took a vast proportion of the economic rent on a centralized, globalized basis. The future is that that economic rent is now going to be shared on a far more community-based basis. And therefore, I question Karl's comment. Karl says, well, it'll take a long time for us to get community-based. I would say we have to make a start. and that where governments need to think about the future is not to try and reinvent energy policies of the past with a set of new technologies of the future, but actually begin to start finding ways of empowering local communities to become more sustainable, to actually manage the energy, food, water nexus more effectively at a local community level. And we need to start that process now. And I would also argue in countries like Oman and the Middle East, community where the hydrocarbons industry is basically declining. I wouldn't necessarily argue the same in Saudi Arabia or wherever, where clearly hydrocarbons are going to go on for the next 20, 25 years without a shadow of a doubt. But in places like Oman, where the cost of production of oil and gas is high, clearly hydrocarbons are reduced, there is an absolute need to move to a more diversified economy, a more community-based economy. And the energy sector have a responsibility to begin to start working that new model and start thinking about that new model in very different ways to the way they have looked at the industry in the past. And that includes skills development.
That essentially requires partnerships and deeper collaboration as well to help get to that point. You know, Karl, Neutral Fuels, I think every other week I'm seeing new partnerships across the company. What have you seen in terms of success models and developing that collaboration and hitting those partnership models? What is your recommendation from that side?
Well,
Oman as well.
Yeah, when I look at the situation in Oman, I think it's got great examples in some of the neighbours of how we could go about this. And to come back to what everybody was saying a moment ago, we were very lucky. We got together in Dubai with all of the waste management companies that, to be honest and without being rude to anybody, are actually waste transportation companies at the moment. They're not managing anything. To come back to Jessica's point, with this new law that comes in January next year, they will actually have to measure how much waste they're collecting, because they're going to be charged landfill charges for each load that they deliver, and the loads will come from multiple customers. So they'll have to be able to proportionally allocate the bill, which means they have to use some sort of measuring technology. Now, we were lucky. We've got great sources of innovation in our universities in Dubai. We were able to pull in 3 recent graduates to develop our own sensors using IoT technology. So we've deployed this now at Expo 2020, where the waste containers for the cooking oil at all of the pavilions at Expo 2020 are themselves intelligent. They tell us when they're full. They tell us where they are, so that we can then allocate a waste collection truck, which is incidentally running on 100% biofuel. The waste collection truck can then go to where it's needed to go, giving us dynamic route optimization. And this allows us to minimize the cost of transportation, to minimize the collection charges, which of course flows through to a better partnership. The way that that's deployed in Abu Dhabi is with the local government, and indeed this is a community initiative, the local government reaching out to private industry and saying, look, we'll make the policy decisions, but we need you to implement this. And from our perspective, there was no money required. The government didn't have to say anything. And all we said to them was, put the policy in place and we'll fund it. We'll make this work as long as we know that you're behind us. And I think those type of private-public partnerships are exactly the way forwards. And I think Oman will be moving ahead. We've seen some great moves by BIA recently in Oman to regulate the export of waste streams. This has come into place in the last 2 weeks in Oman, so that it is now illegal, sorry, not illegal, it's overtaxed to export waste cooking oil out of the country. So now by taxation, it's been possible to constrain the raw material so that it stays in country, so that we can process it in country. And this is providing new employment, this is providing innovation opportunities, it's providing all the good things that we want as a society.
Aditya, I just want to bring you in on that, to follow up on, of course, these comments that we're hearing. And of course, those partnerships and those frameworks, I imagine, bring in the opportunity for further investments as well in that space, where right now it's kind of hard if there's not that monitoring structure there to bring in. If we look at Oman right now, who's looking to bring in investments as well through EDO, for example, which is the holding company. there's still that kind of foundation that needs to be created. Just want to get your recommendations and thoughts on that aspect.
Yeah, and just like what Karl said, and there need to be a right balance of incentives and disincentives in place. So incentives for recyclers, or for industries that would like to reutilize these resources, to invest, and at the same time there has to be a disincentive for consumers, or for essentially the polluter pays principle, that there has to be an extended responsibility on the producers and the consumers of these resources, and not just to dispose them of appropriately, but there has to be a cost associated with the disposal and the treatment of all of these wastes that are going through currently to the landfills. So you have to have these balance of incentives and disincentives which are coming in, and at the same time a regulatory framework which supports or monitors the supply chain of the entire resources that we are utilizing. So unless there is a regulatory framework and the appropriateness of incentives and disincentives, there isn't really much investment which is coming through to these sectors currently.
Jessica, just following up on that in terms of supply chains, from the oil and gas companies earlier, people look at them as the heart of this transition, of course, this nexus, but really it's across the supply chains in terms of being decarbonized. And the managing director of PDO had mentioned that it's a big pillar of their vision moving forward. What is your suggestions in terms of addressing the supply chain issue, and what you think the next steps forward is in doing so?
So when we look into the food, water, energy nexus, that came a lot in the highlight in the pandemic, when we had food security concerns because of all the supply chain disruptions. So a lot of this needs to be on the local level. But I think we're going to need a lot of engagement in between national institutes, because we also lack that a lot. So if you're going to look into a nexus, we do need better engagement across all the institutes. We do need policies not to be fragmented, not to be segregated by one institute, but to be a collaborative kind of mechanisms. And if you're going to look into more community-based, people-centered approach, we need to put the people also as part of this in terms of public consultation. So that would open also the road to more innovation and more entrepreneurship and more mechanisms.
Peter, just building off of that, one of the survey questions today was, should Oman have a ministry that covers water, food, energy nexus, a specific nexus ministry for policies? What are I would say the answer was 60% yes, 40% no. Do you think that idea of bringing one body together to oversee this nexus and push a circular economy forward is the correct approach, or do you think that would add just another layer? We're talking about policies being siloed at the moment, but another layer that just kind of fractures it or slows acceleration down in a sense.
So I guess my answer is I'm no politician, so I won't comment on ministries or whether they should exist or not. But one thing I will say from a Singapore perspective is that although we don't have a Nexus ministry, we have a very, very strong push by government to think about the whole Nexus question and the whole energy transition question on a one government basis, by which we recognize here, as a government, that there is an absolute need to coordinate across ministries. And actually that creates a lot of challenges. And it also creates a lot of challenges back to this whole economic rent and supply chain issue, in that, of course, in the past, global trade and supply chains were set up on the basis of a set of trading mechanisms that to a certain extent are rapidly changing now as a result of more localization. So as a result of COVID, as a result of the energy transition, as a result of things that we've talked about now, there is a great move to create more localized supply chains that actually take out a large area where profit was made by the energy sector in the past, which was actually the discontinuity of global supply chains. Is people made money out of the fact that you couldn't get a decent service unless you went through this long supply chain. The whole answer now is to actually create something that is more efficient at a local level. And that requires a whole set of new policies when it comes to looking at the way economies run and are managed in the future at both a national, regional, and global basis. And to me, that's the challenge now with, you know, organizations like the World Trade Organization and other multilateral institutions, because clearly they are very challenged in terms of how to deal with that fundamental change in the dynamics that we will have going forward. So we're at the beginning of that. We're in chapter 1 of this story. But the way to fix this is certainly for governments to think to the future and think about how to coordinate their economies at a more localized, community-based level.
Karl, you know, governments move at a certain pace, but of course the private sector and the industry can move a little bit quicker in a sense. What can the private sector be doing now to accelerate this while, you know, let's say the government aspect moves along and tries to figure things out from a policy level?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, certainly, again, I speak from the fuels perspective, but we have multinationals committing to using biofuels within their supply chains on a global basis. And where they have regional operations, they're just mandating it. So we, as an organization, we're now present in eight cities in the region. And we're not waiting for government policy on mandating the use of biofuels. We're just looking to the multinationals that we have as our existing customers who are all coming to us and saying, please, can we buy more? You know, our biggest challenge is how we can grow faster. We're not constrained by government policies in the slightest. In most of the markets we've gone into, we are the first mover, which presents its own challenges. Trying to get a license permitting you to do something that doesn't exist is always a bit of an innovative challenge, but it's getting easier the more countries we go into. But we're certainly seeing the situation where those global multinationals have got the commitments in place to do things which are more sustainable, lower carbon footprint, and they are prepared to adopt a global policy and just implement it in all of their regional offices. So for us, it's certainly moving as fast as I've ever seen anything move. It's unbelievable, the pace, but it's being driven by industry, and those industries are being driven by lots of things, but their shareholders on the various public stock exchanges, their customers in global markets, and I would actually say to a lesser extent, the governments. I think that the industry is actually more in tune with the current zeitgeist than maybe some of the governments are, and they don't want to be seen as the dirty company in their industry. They just all want to be cleaning up.
And it is interesting to see, you know, I think His Excellency Sultan Al Jaber mentioned in ADIPEC last week that solutions should come from where the experience is in the energy industry. And, you know, we're talking about COP26, where that industry was not, let's say, brought to the forefront there to be able to collaborate. Aditya, I just want to get your follow-up comments on that as well, from your thoughts from Create Capital. Do you really need that incentive from the policies and the regulations, or are you diving in head first and pushing things through from your side in terms of incentives?
So like Karl said, you know, there are a lot of organizations, or, you know, you see the private sector, you know, voluntarily taking up all of these initiatives. So, you know, to be more sustainable in their businesses, to be more sustainable in their activities. So we see a lot of that already going through in some of the sectors. So, you know, whether it is renewable energy, for instance, or, you know, energy efficiency, we see a lot of organizations taking proactive steps in, you know, being a lot more responsible and decreasing their carbon footprint. In some of the sectors, we see that there is a need to have a regulatory framework in place to be able to do it. You know, for instance, you know, whether it is waste management or whether it is some of the other sectors where there is the need for an enabling environment to be able to invest more capital into those sectors. But, you know, so I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. So there are some sectors where, you know, regardless of the policy framework, you see a lot of initiatives being undertaken. There are some sectors where, you know, there are stumbling blocks in terms of the supporting regulatory environment, which to be fair, is being addressed. And, I think over the next couple of years, we'd see a lot more decarbonization efforts being taken here in the region.
Jessica, I also just want to get your thoughts on that in terms of that push-pull. Do you think that the slowness of those regulations aspects is going to be an hindrance, or are you seeing things moving full steam ahead in a sense?
I do believe in the prospects for technology and innovation normally, and the markets and the private sector to drive things forward. But I also do worry about disruptions from political and governance side if you do not have an enabling environment presented in terms of regulations that provide an incentive for things to move in the right direction. So I'm in between. I do normally favor having some sort of regulation in terms, but you also, as we promote more partnerships, we also would require less unilateral decision making from the state side.
Just touching on the innovation aspects, what is your thoughts in terms of creating innovation ecosystems here in the Middle East, in terms of R&D, academia, industry alignment? Are you seeing progression in that space? We're talking about, communities and localization. Inevitably, you can't really keep importing ideas and solutions and technology. You have to create that ecosystem locally as well. Are you seeing progress in that space, or do you think that alignment between industry and academia is still kind of fractured a bit?
Well, between industry and academia, it could still remain a bit fragmented, but we're seeing a lot of push in terms of R&D, and we're seeing better ecosystems promoting startups in the region. And that's mostly driven by first need for more employment opportunities. But also all the opportunities and innovation that the technology is presenting. We see in Oman, they're focusing more and more on funding R&D, research and development. We're seeing more, we cannot keep importing innovation from abroad. We're seeing more the private sector taking a push forward, startups across the Middle East, especially in the Gulf countries. So I think that it's going to be more need-driven moving forward as the impact of the pandemic and the economic recession drives the need for more employment opportunities. That this is going to be more naturally, more natural.
It seems that things are moving by pretty quickly. We're just coming up on 40 minutes right now. So just in terms of closing comments, I'd just like to ask each of you, if we were to create an action plan for circular economy, incorporating the food, water, energy nexus, what would be your top recommendation or action to put on that plan? And I imagine there's going to be some crossover, seeing that there's kind of a central theme to this from all that I've spoken. But Karl, starting with you, what do you think would have to be that top action to implement to really accelerate things?
I really think that what we need to be doing is calling on all the countries, specifically in this region, to adopt the Basel Convention on Waste Management. They're mostly signatories to it. There's one or two countries that are not yet. But that convention has a lot of really good philosophies in it, based on the concept of polluter pays, which has been mentioned earlier, based on the concept that you've got to measure your waste, that you have to have a proper landfill charge, and you have to use that as leverage to try and persuade people to repurpose and recycle. But the other thing which is definitely contained in the Basel Convention is a statement that if you have facilities in country for recycling the waste stream, then the signatory government should pass legislation to ban the export of that waste stream. And that is contained within the wording of the convention. It's something that's been signed up to. And that provides the financing element that the private industries are desperately looking for. If you can't be sure that you're going to get the waste stream, and therefore the volumes, and therefore the financial return, you're never going to invest into a country. But I think once everybody adopts that Basel Convention and puts it into legislation, we'll see the private industry will jump in And I mean, we've already been doing it. We're piloting in many countries. We're in full rollout in lots of other countries, but we've seen lots of other industries, water, plastic recycling, tire recycling. All of these people want to come in. They just need the framework to be there that says, if you come in, you're going to have a forecastable, known return from your investment.
Aditya, do you want to follow up with that with your top action and recommendation? I think Karl hit on some good points there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, just looking at the discussion we've had so far, it's not just the water, food, energy nexus, it's the water, food, energy, waste nexus. So, I think the top action plan is, to introduce waste as a key pillar of, a circular economy, and, like all of us have, I think I would say unanimously agreed, is decentralization of the infrastructure. So you have to close the loop locally. And like Karl said, you have to close the borders for export of waste. You need to create the incentives to repurpose and recycle the waste locally. And that can only happen when you take a holistic view of all these four. So, I mean, if 70% of water is used for irrigation and food purposes, there's a need to look at more, sustainable agricultural practices, which is happening in the region. So, today the region is a hotbed for controlled environment agriculture. You see so much of investments being directed towards controlled environment agriculture. And one of the key benefits of that is, reducing water by up to 95%, reducing, the footprint of the food traveling to your plate. Today nobody talks about, the miles that the food travels to come to your plate, and that's, the carbon footprint of the food we consume is a very, very important element of, closing the loop. So I'd say, the emphasis on more sustainable agricultural practices and including waste within the water, food, energy nexus. I think two big recommendations from my side.
Peter, what would be your top recommendation and action point? I think we have two that have covered quite a wide range. What would be your final thoughts?
I would say, going back to the energy, food, water, waste nexus, to me, the big issue is that when we look at the energy sector, food sector, water sector, they are still very traditional in terms of looking at the energy sector, the water sector, the food sector. They are not looking at the nexus. So to me, in addition to Karl's point, which I think is the number one, for me too, I would also say that businesses, organizations, multinational organizations, have got to stop saying that their core expertise is only in energy, in that I believe that at the end of the day, technology integration, the integration of water technologies with energy technologies, with food technologies, is the way forwards. And that requires fundamentally different business models in the future. Now, it's going to take us time to get to that model, but the journey starts now, folks. So get on with it.
Jessica, we'll close off the session with you. Your final thoughts and top recommendation.
Yeah, so I just have a few points to add, which is to really conduct assessments of the supply chain to see how we can localize and where we can across the supply chain. We can have things on a local basis. Digitization, decentralization, as we've spoken across this session, and design thinking sprees. I do believe we need better communication channels and better collaboration to enable all this innovation and collaboration between all the institutes, public institutes, and finally mainstreaming circular economy across policies.
Well, thank you very much to our distinguished speakers today, Karl, Aditya, Peter, of course, Jessica,